In today's episode, we're going over should you use isometrics to treat tendinopathy? And I'm also going to go over how I use them as a physical therapist in clinical practice. Let's do it. So, what's kind of the problem here? Well, I feel like every few years a new research study comes out talking about the next treatment for tendinopathy. Okay. So heavy slow loads are pretty popular right now. Isometrics popular. I see surgeons all the time recommend eccentrics for tendinopathy, right? So I think what happens is that one study comes out and everyone is like, let's use this treatment, right? But there becomes a lot of confusion because there's a lot of research about a lot of different types of treatments, right? So, what is effective and what is most effective? And where do isometrics fit in? I think isometrics is actually pretty interesting because they have more of a short term effect. And I feel like most physical therapists I talk to don't know about this. They're using isometrics more for longer term effect, which I think you can use them for. But I think the research that made them popular, we're looking at this short term effect. So, in today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about this. So, in today's episode, we're going to go over the history of isometrics. Why did they become so popular in the first place, right? Who are the researchers that originally put out this research that got the whole world kind of hot on the topic? Next, we're going to go over what are isometrics effective for? What does the evidence say about tendon problems? Next, we're going to go over where do they fit into a plan of care as a physical therapist? Where do you put them into it? Your training program, right? Next, we'll decide whether or not you even want to use them. And lastly, we'll just talk a bit about how I implement them into my own clinical practice. So before we really get going, I want to let you know about a free cheat sheet I have for you. I'll leave a link in the show notes. I definitely think you should check it out. It is an evidence-based cheat sheet to patellar tendinopathy. So I know that this talk today is about isometrics, but the large majority of research in isometrics is going to be on the patellar tendon, right? So in this cheat sheet, we're going to go over what is patellar tendinopathy, what's the prevalence of patellar tendinopathy, the clinical presentation, diagnosis, and treatment options. I definitely recommend you check it out. Like I said, isometrics are studied mainly in the patellar tendon. So I think this is going to help you out a ton. It's a free resource, and I'll leave a link in the show notes for you to check it out. Welcome to the Fitness Pain-Free Show. This is where we help coaches and physical therapists like yourself get your patients out of pain and back in the gym where they belong. My name is Dan Pope. I'm a physical therapist, coach, personal trainer, and meathead. I have my dream job as a physical therapist, coach, and business owner and educator. I've been doing this for several decades now. I want to help you reach your goals as a coach and clinician. Let's get moving. Before we get started here, I just want to let you guys know this is part 2 of a 2-part series on isometrics. If you haven't checked out part 1 yet, I highly recommend you do that before proceeding here. I'll leave a link in the show notes. You can check that out. Otherwise, let's get rolling. So how do I like to use isometrics for my tendinopathy patients? So I want to tell you about a little story. So back in 2015, when the original article came out by Ebony Rio showing these large changes in pain after isometrics, I was pretty hot on using isometrics. I was using it in all of my tendon pain patients. I thought it was pretty cool. I was getting good to mixed results. And then one day I got a pretty gnarly Achilles tendinopathy, right? And I was like, great, I've got some Achilles tendinopathy. Let me try some isometrics and see if it improves my Achilles tendon pain, right? And my tendon was pretty painful. And I was living in Colorado at the time. And I loved hiking. And we were about to go hiking that weekend. I was like, okay, I'll use the isometrics before I go hiking and we'll see how it goes. Hopefully, I can reduce my tendon pain. And to be honest, my tendon was not really killing me at the time. But I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll have a better hiking experience if I do some isometrics. So we get to the mountain, right? And we're about to go hiking. And I'm talking to my wife. I'm like, hey, you okay if I do a little warm up for my tendon? It hurts a bunch. And I want to try to warm it up some so we have a better hiking experience. She's like, yeah, go for it. So I start my isometrics. And to be honest, it's not the same setup as Ebony Rio would use, right? It was me trying to hold a calf raise. That was my isometric, right? So essentially, I get done like one set. All right, feels pretty good. Rest a little bit, move on to set 2, and I get sharp pain in my Achilles tendon, right? Okay, that's not good. I rest a little bit. I try to go again, same sharp pain, right? And my hike that day was miserable, right? I flared up my Achilles tendon. I couldn't hike. I felt god awful. And at that point, it made me feel like isometrics weren't as powerful as I once thought. And I actually kind of got down on isometrics for a little bit, right? As often with human beings, when you have this negative emotion associated with the treatment, you get biases with it, right? And I kind of wrote off isometrics for a little bit, especially as some of this research was coming out showing that isometrics and isotonics were pretty similar. I was like, you know what? I'm not going to use them quite as much. And then I read a research article about isometrics and Achilles tendon pain. And essentially, it was showing there was no difference between isometrics and no isometrics immediately following. And I was like, all right, confirmation bias. I hurt my Achilles when I tried to do isometrics. That makes sense. But what was kind of cool is that the study included a scatter plot. So essentially, on this plot, they had the VAS scale. So on a 0 out of 10, how much pain you experience during a functional load test like a calf raise prior to doing isometrics, then afterwards, right? And the results were really interesting because the study overall kind of concluded that the average person had no change in pain doing isometrics. But you had several people, let's say around 20% of the people included in the study, had a phenomenal result with the isometrics. And about 20% of those folks had a terrible result. It made their pain much worse. And then the rest of the people were right in the middle, right? They had no effect. Okay. And this was a bit of an eye-opening moment for me, especially because if I was in this study, I would be in that group that did worse. Okay. Very clearly based on my own experiment. However, there are a bunch of people that do phenomenal as well. Right. And lastly, the majority of folks are kind of in the middle. So I think what I did is initially I was super hot on isometrics, and then I hurt myself doing isometrics, and I threw the baby out with the bathwater. Essentially, I really do believe there's some folks that are going to do very well with isometrics. It just might not be every single person that you work with. So this slowly changed my mind over the course of time, and it kind of adapted the way I do isometrics now in my clinical practice. So guys, if you like what you're learning about so far, then I want you to go and check out the Fitness Pain-Free Mini Course. So I made a mini course. It's absolutely free. That's the next logical step if you want to learn more from me. So in the course, we go over 5 lessons. That first lesson is how traditional schooling has failed us, right? So schooling is phenomenal from a physical therapy perspective, but doesn't really teach you how to work with high-level athletes in the fitness world, right? Doesn't always teach you how to do the lifts appropriately. Doesn't teach you about progressions and regressions of common lifts within the gym. Doesn't teach you how to program normally, how to write rehab programs, or how to write injury prevention programs for these folks. Next thing we go over, 7 reasons why people get hurt in the gym. 4 simple steps to getting your clients out of pain. How to build the career of your dreams and earn the respect of your community. It's all well and good if you know exactly how to work with folks within the gym. But if you can't get these folks through the door on a regular basis, then you're simply not going to be living the dream that you want to, because you can't get the patients through the door that you want to work with. Okay. So I'll show you how to do that. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the Fitness Pain-Free certification, right? So I'll leave a link in the show notes. I definitely recommend checking this out. Once you sign up for the Fitness Pain-Free Mini Course, you will be automatically placed in the waitlist for the Fitness Pain-Free certification. Now, the Fitness Pain-Free certification is the course, the certification that I wish I had as a new grad that fills in all the gaps in knowledge that you don't get in physical therapy school. So A, you'll gain complete confidence working with injuries in the strength and fitness world. You'll learn optimal technique for both health and performance from myself and some of the best coaches in the world. You'll master programming for rehabilitation and injury prevention. Have fun while earning a whole bunch of physical therapy and physical therapy assistant credits. You have 31.5 of those. You'll also gain NSCA credits as well as CrossFit credits if you need those. This is the equivalent of a university education in working with injuries in the weight room. I really believe that. I've been adding to this thing over the past 5 or 6 years. It's massive, a ton of phenomenal information. And lastly, the biggest goal is just to fill your day with the patients you love working with and building the respect and admiration of the communities you love working with. So I'll leave a link in the show notes. Sign up for the Fitness Pain-Free Mini Course. The certification is open 4 times per year for 1 week to enroll into. If you're on the wait list by signing up for the Fitness Pain-Free Mini Course, I'll alert you when that next enrollment period is open and you can get started. Let's get back to the show now. So now the way I like to use isometrics in clinical practice is that if I have a patient that has a tendinopathy, right? Let's say it's really aggravated and they're having a hard time performing exercise in the gym, or let's say they're having a hard time doing something they love, like running. I will have them try isometrics and then have them try to do a workout and see if it has a substantial change on their pain. And here's the thing. If it works, and in some folks it works phenomenally, they feel really, really good afterwards. Great. We'll keep using them. And if it doesn't work, especially if it makes them feel worse afterwards, I don't use it, right? So it becomes pretty easy from a critical reasoning perspective, because if we are getting a big reduction in pain, which is what we want with isometrics, then great, we'll use them. But if it's not, then we don't have to. The other thing to keep in mind is that tendons generally have a warm-up effect. So you don't always have to do isometrics prior to starting your physical therapy treatment or prior to training, right? Prior to a game, whatever you're using it for. You can also use isotonics. So I'll trial out some isometrics, I'll trial out some isotonics, and then we'll train and we'll see what works the best. Just got to be honest, I actually have a bit of a bias towards just doing a bunch of isotonics. So my patients that have quad or patellar tendinopathy, I often have them warm up with a bunch of reverse leg drags or some sissy squat TKEs, lighter weights, kind of a pump type deal. And they usually feel phenomenal afterwards, right? And my bias is to use those. So if the isometrics are working, great, use them. If the isometrics are not working really well, you don't have to use them, right? The next thing I want you to think about is whether or not you even need to use any sort of warm-up. Do you need to use isometrics? Do you need to use isotonics? I'm going to bring up something called the pain monitoring model. So this has been around for years. This has been around for years. The person who kind of popularized it to me is Karin Sobernagel. I'm probably saying her name wrong. I apologize. Her research was in the Achilles tendon in folks who have Achilles tendinopathy. And essentially, they had 2 groups of people, right? The first group was encouraged to work through some pain as long as the pain was under a 5 out of 10. And the following day, they're back to their baseline with a functional test, right? The other group was not allowed to push through pain during exercises. What they found is that over the course of time, both groups improved at the same rate, okay? What that means is that you're going to be able to have your patients continue exercising, both allowing them to do the activities they like to, that provoke the tendon a little bit, as long as it doesn't go above that 4 out of 10, right? And the next day they're back down to their baseline. So if folks are having pain in the gym, it's not like we have to get rid of the pain prior to them exercising, okay? Jeremy Lewis was a guy who was big on this initially. He used a symptom modification strategy during scaption in patients with rotator cuff tendinopathy. And initially his thought was, hey, let's try to find the position of your shoulder blades, right? The amount of upward rotation, the amount of scapular elevation or depression that reduces the symptoms as much as possible during an exercise like scaption. Later research showed that you can work through pain, and it doesn't matter. Patients get better at a similar rate, right? So if you're going to get patients better at a similar rate, whether or not they work through pain or not, then why do we have to try so hard to get their pain levels down prior to exercise? So at least in my mind, if you have a patient that has a tendinopathy, and they're having minimal pain with exercise, I don't even feel like I have to warm them up very much. I don't think I need to spend the 15 minutes to do 5 sets of 45-second isometrics, right? With a 2-minute rest period in between at 70% of the patients, max. That's a lot of time. So you might not even need to do any sort of isometric isotonic to warm people up, or maybe you just don't need as many sets or reps, right? In order to get people going. So one caveat to all of this is that oftentimes patients' pain will change their exercise technique substantially, okay? I think running is a really good example. So I had a patient recently that had a lateral hip pain, glute medius tendinopathy, and essentially she wasn't really able to hip drop at all. It was too painful. every time you run and take a step, you have to hip drop a little bit. So she wasn't able to do that due to pain. And when she tried to run, she would limp. There'd be a pretty severe limp when she was running. So one of the treatment strategies that we gave to her was an isometric. So she basically just stood up next to a wall, picked up the leg that was closest to the wall and pressed it into the wall, right? We did 4 sets of 45 seconds, 2 per side, and had her run afterwards. I actually tried some isotonics with her. I think at the end of the day, we did kind of 2 sets of isometrics and 2 sets of isotonics. Then I had her walk, and then we did a return to run protocol, which is a mix of running and walking. And her technique substantially improved to the point that I wasn't concerned about her learning weird habits or hurting something else because she's limping while running. And in my mind, this was a major win because adding the isometrics as well as the isotonics was very helpful so that she can actually continue running without limping and building bad habits. So if you have a patient that is looking very bad in the gym or with their kind of functional activities, so if someone's trying to squat and the patellar tendon is so painful, they shift, right? So they're spinning, their hips are kind of off to the side, right? Then I think it's a good idea to try some isometrics and isotonics because we can reduce pain, hopefully, load that area a little bit better, and have better technique during our exercises and training. So one place where I think isometrics and isotonics are really nice are in those folks that, let's say, can still exercise, right, with minimal pain, but their pain is bad enough that it makes them change their technique or kind of limp while they're running, right? So I think that's still a good reason for those folks. So where else can we use isometrics in our rehabilitation for our patients with tendon problems? So one way to use isometrics I think is great. Comes from a study in JOSPT in 2015. This is Peter Malieris et al. With Joel Cook, Craig Purdom, Ebony Rio, probably one of the most famous researchers in the tendon world that I know of. They used a phased approach. So this is based on the idea that the hardest thing for a tendon to do is utilize its elastic storage capabilities, right? So when you jump, right, imagine what the patellar tendon and Achilles tendon has to do. It has to store elastic energy and release it very quickly, right? That's the job of a tendon, one of the jobs of a tendon. So if you're trying to move with a lot of load very quickly, right? Think about jumping or jumping with a weighted vest. That's a ton of stress on the tendon, okay? The slower you start to move, the less energy storage you need. So if you're utilizing isometric contraction, there's no energy storage demand because there's no motion, okay? So that was one of the reasons why people started to use isometrics, especially isometric research in, let's say, in-season athletes prior to training, prior to game situation work, just because it's probably not as much stress on the tendon. And if it warms up that tendon prior to playing, that's a big win. Now, you can use this idea in rehabilitation just because most folks, when they first injure a tendon, when they first have, let's say, a reactive tendinopathy, it's super duper tender, right? And they might not even tolerate motion at all, right? Let's say you have a really bad reactive tendinopathy in the Achilles, and I ask you to do a bunch of calf raises, even slow. Let's say I have you do it with both legs at the same time to offload it even a little bit more. It may be still too painful to tolerate. However, if we try an isometric, it might actually feel pretty good. So isometrics are a way to get some load through the tendon when things are really flared up and you can't do other forms of exercise, right? So what this study recommended is to start with isometric exercises in your patients that are really flared up. Once your patients can handle a little bit of load, we can start to load them. They recommended eventually working towards heavy, slow loads. And then once patients are tolerating the heavy, slow loads really well, we go back to using the tendon for its job, which is energy storage. So essentially adding in plyometrics towards the end stages of rehab. So in a nutshell, really flared up patients, we start with isometrics. We progress towards isotonics with heavy, slow loads and eccentrics. And the last bit of the puzzle is to get people back to sport. And we have to introduce plyometrics, running, change of direction work, whatever that is, to get the athlete back to play, right? The other place where isometrics can be a really nice option are going to be in season, right? I said this in part one of this two-part podcast series. If you didn't check out part one, do it now. It's in the show notes. Essentially, in the first study I mentioned, the second study I mentioned, they were looking at isometrics and isotonics in in-season athletes. And typically these folks tend to get worse over the course of a season, right? Not everybody, but at least the ones in my experience, they tend to get worse over the course of the season. It's just really, really tough to get them through the season and have that tendon pain go down. However, isometrics aren't that much stress on the tendon. Tendon's probably already taken too much stress because this athlete is trying to continue playing their sport, trying to continue practicing. Their pain continues to go up and up just because it's too much volume for that irritated tendon. If we add more exercise on top of that, heavy, slow loads, eccentrics, it might be too much. It might even make them worse throughout the course of the season, right? So if you utilize isometrics, it's not that much stress on the tendon. So in season, it might be a really good option for these athletes to get a little load through the tendon, reduce pain without going overboard, right? The last place I like to use isometrics, and we kind of noted towards this a little bit earlier, is I like to use it in a warm-up, right? So let's say you have a patient that always has shoulder pain, right? And it takes them 20 minutes to warm up every single bench press day just so they can bench press and get through the workout, right? Now, this person, and I'm sure you've heard this story, has had pain for the past 5 years. And all they do is warm up their tendon for 20 minutes prior to bench press every single Monday, right? And their pain doesn't get better. Now, isometrics can be helpful for this person, but you have to figure out why they're hurting in the first place. This person is not going to do well if you just give them a warm up and tell them continue doing what they're doing, right? They'll probably have pain for the rest of their life. So you have to make sure as a caveat that you figure out the reason why your patients are having pain. You have to maybe back off with some of the load that they're using during bench press. Maybe they need a higher frequency of exercises to stress whatever tendon is giving them pain. And as long as you're doing that, I think adding a nice warm up makes your training go much more smoothly. So I've posted a bunch of warm ups I like to use in folks that have tendon pain. I'll put some links in the show notes so you guys can definitely check that out. But a good example is a shoulder warm up prior to a bench press day or prior to an overhead press day. I'll have athletes perform a scaption isometric, a pec fly isometric, some external rotation isometrics, and then I'll have them perform a lot of warm-up sets before they do, let's say, a bench press. And oftentimes it allows them to train much, much more comfortably, right? And I think you can use this for multiple tendon problems. I had mentioned this previously, but in my patients that have a quad tendinopathy or they have a patellar tendinopathy, one of the things I like to do besides just isometrics is to try some isotonics, like using reverse leg drags, maybe walking backwards on a treadmill, doing some sissy squats, some terminal knee extensions, some sissy squat terminal knee extensions, right? Maybe we also add in some knee extension isometrics. And what you may find is that these athletes can now move a little bit better. Let's say they do this prior to a squat day and they have been compensating a little bit toward those heavy sets just because the knee is so painful. Now, when they get to those heavy sets, they're not compensating anymore. I think that's a major win. I think the other piece where this is especially helpful is from a psychological standpoint, right? Oftentimes you have those athletes that are kind of afraid to push through pain. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of the athletes I work with, they push through way too much pain. And sometimes I'm actually trying to give them a little bit of fear and just let them know, like, hey, you shouldn't be pushing through as much pain. It's probably why your tendon pain is getting worse or not improving, right? I'm not talking about those folks. They probably don't need isometrics. They probably just need to listen to their bodies and back off a little bit. But for the folks that are a little bit more fearful of training, isometrics and isotonics can be really helpful just because whenever they feel some pain in the gym, they often get scared and they get very frustrated, right? They feel like they need to stop. So if you can make them feel a lot better and they have substantially less pain in the gym, this is going to allow them to continue training, which is going to push them in the right direction, obviously. And they won't be as frustrated, right? And they're much less likely to be fearful of movement if the movement is not painful, okay? So there's a variety of situations where you can still use isometrics in your rehabilitation. However, I also like to think about using isotonics and basically just utilize what works best for your athletes, okay? Everyone's going to have their own specific needs, right? Think about sports specificity. Is your athlete trying to get back to squatting, right? Are you working with a power lifter, or are you working with a jumper? Because a jumper is going to have to get back to a lot of plyometrics, but an Olympic weightlifter, not quite as much. Do they move a barbell pretty quickly? Yes, they do. But are they moving it with the same speed as they would in, let's say, a jump, right? Is a tendon having that same demand? No. So they probably need to be treated differently. So keep that patient in mind as well. So if you are loving what you are learning right now, I highly recommend you check out my fitness pain-free episode where we go over a patellar and quadriceps tendinopathy guide. I will leave a link in the show notes. Definitely recommend checking it out. You can also click on the link right above if you're watching this on YouTube and get started watching right away. And lastly, thank you so much for your support. You truly allow me to do what I love for a living. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that like button, comment, and subscribe. It helps me out tremendously. If you're watching this as a podcast, please leave me a positive rating and review. Helps a ton with the algorithm, helps me grow. If you want to see me do more of these in the future, that would help out a ton. I highly appreciate it. If you want to go that extra step in supporting me, consider subscribing to Fitness Pain Free Insiders. It's basically a comprehensive educational resource and toolkit for the fitness and rehab professional. Think Netflix, but for coaches and physical therapists. It's all premium content from me, similar to the Fitness Pain Free Show, but more in depth. It's updated monthly. I've been doing this for the past 5 years or so. It's got over 100 webinars, ebooks, and complete guides. You have access to a private Facebook group to me. We have all your questions answered. You can get started. There's a trial period. It's actually prices bumped up. I apologize, it's a little bit old, to $5 a month, right? For 1 week, and you try it out. If you don't like it, you can cancel at any time. But like I said, if you want to support me a little bit further and take that next step in your learning experience, Fitness Pain Free Insiders is it. I'll leave a link in the show notes, but if you want to get started right away, head to fitnesspainfree.com, click on the programs link, and click on Fitness Pain Free Insiders Online Library. I'll see you there on the inside. If you want to check out the references, I will also leave them in the show notes. You can tell me if I missed any references or maybe I misinterpreted the literature. If you feel like I did, please let me know. Leave a link in the comments, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Thank you.